The wagon rolled into Alma on a Tuesday, late in September of 1874, when the cottonwoods along the Republican River had just begun to turn, and the air carried the first serious suggestion of what was coming. The town paused in the way that small places do, not rudely, but completely, when something unusual arrived. What arrived was unusual. He stepped down from the hired wagon first, tall and unhurried, wearing a wool frock coat of charcoal gray that had no business being within 300 miles of a Nebraska cornfield. His boots were polished. His hat brim was level. He turned and offered his hand, and she descended in a silk-trimmed traveling dress the color of late clover, her dark hair pinned with the kind of precision that suggested she had not slept against a wagon board the night before, though she had. They stood together on the packed dirt street of Alma and looked at it with the same expression, measured, patient, as though the town were a text they intended to read carefully before forming any opinion. The grain merchant, sweeping his step, stopped sweeping. The two of them walked to the general store. This was noted. They spent 40 minutes inside, which was also noted. What they asked for was recorded later, in the way that small towns record things, through repetition, at supper tables, across fence lines. They had asked about soil drainage east of the creek, about whether the miller accepted cornmeal trade, about the nearest dairy operation and whether dried whey was available in quantity, about lumber salvage, about straw, about the depth at which the frost line sat in a hard winter. Not one question about neighbors, not one question about the nearest church social or the name of the county judge. The storekeeper answered each question with the steady patience of a man who has decided to reserve judgment, and they thanked him once, precisely, and left. Their claim sat 2 miles east of town. They drove to it that same afternoon and walked it on foot for 2 hours while the hired wagon driver waited, puzzled, on the seat. He carried a small leather-bound journal, brown, worn at the corners as if it had made the journey from Philadelphia in a coat pocket, which it had. She walked slightly ahead at certain points, testing the ground with the heel of her boot, pausing where the creek bent, looking south and then north along the cut of the land as though calculating something. The sod house on the claim was one room, packed earth floor, a cast-iron stove that would do its work if tended, one glass window, south-facing, which she stood before for a long moment, measuring the light with her eyes. He wrote something in the journal. She noted the 3-sided hay shelter 30 yards off, open to the south, still holding the ghost smell of animals that had wintered in it before. They did not say much to each other. They did not need to. There was a quality to their silence that was not empty but occupied, full of the same careful attention they had given the storekeeper's answers. The cottonwoods threw long shadows east. The auction was held the following morning in a yard behind the grain mill, which smelled of chaff and cold mud and the particular sourness of animals kept too close together for too long. A dozen men stood in a loose ring around the pens. They wore canvas coats and held their hats against a wind that came off the flat land without apology. She stood at the edge of the ring in her silk-trimmed traveling dress, which had survived the rail journey better than it had survived the wagon road. He stood beside her in his wool frock coat, journal already open, pencil already moving. The first lots sold quickly. Good stock, healthy coloring, proper weight for the season. Each sale drew a nod or two, a hand raised, a number called out by the auctioneer with the practiced ease of a man who had done this every autumn for 15 years. She watched and noted. He wrote. Then the last pen was opened. 72 piglets came forward in a knot of unhappy motion, thin through the shoulders, rough-coated, several with the shallow, effortful breathing that signals an animal borrowing against a debt it cannot pay. The mud on them was not the ordinary mud of a pig's preference, but the caked, gray-white mud of animals left standing too long in one place. The auctioneer did not try hard. He said, "Offered as a lot. I'll start low." He named no figure because there was no figure to name. He waited. No hand moved. A man near the mill door said something to the man beside him. There was quiet laughter. A farmer's wife, standing with her husband at the far rail, shook her head once, decisively. She looked at the piglets. He looked at the piglets. Then they looked at each other, and the look lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which, between two people who do not speak unnecessarily, is a long conversation. She gave the smallest inclination of her head. Not a nod exactly, more the closing of a calculation. He raised his hand and said $4 for the lot. The auctioneer blinked. He repeated the bid aloud as though checking that he had heard correctly. Then he brought the gavel down before any objection could form, which was, in its way, a mercy. The laughter was not unkind in the sense of cruelty, but it was complete. It came from at least 4 directions at once: the grain merchant near the mill, the livery owner leaning on a post, the farmer's wife at the rail, and the county land agent who had arrived late and now stood at the pen's edge observing the new owners with an expression of professional skepticism. $4, someone said, for that lot. The land agent wrote something in his own ledger and did not look up again. They arranged to have the animals driven to the claim that afternoon. The hired wagon would be needed a second time. She went to the general store to inquire about dried whey. He stayed to count the animals and record the first observation. Weight, estimated. Coat, poor. Respiration, labored in approximately 1 in 5, in a column that would not be closed until spring. The creek ran clear and cold that first afternoon, fed by a limestone shelf upstream that kept it from clouding after rain. He found this useful. She found it necessary. Together they carried the first 6 animals down the bank in a canvas sling he had fashioned from a section of wagon cover, and they set them in the shallows where the water moved, but did not rush. The smell had been the first warning. Not the ordinary smell of swine, which any farmer expected, but something underneath it, sour and close, the smell of animals that had not been dry in weeks. When she knelt at the waterline in her silk-trimmed traveling dress and began working her fingers through the caked mud on the nearest piglet's flank, she did not comment on the dress. She did not comment on the cold water. She worked with the same attention she would have given to a lesson plan, methodical, patient, turning the animal gently in the current. He recorded what they found as they found it. The first piglet, once the mud had loosened and been rinsed away, showed a coat that was thin but intact. No lesions, no swelling at the joints. Ribs visible and countable, but the structure beneath them was sound. He wrote, no disease evident. Starvation, primary. Cold, secondary. Prognosis guarded but not closed. The second showed something similar. The third as well. By the 6th animal, they had established a preliminary finding that would govern every decision made afterward. The mud had not been protecting these animals. It had been hiding them from accurate assessment, from warmth, from the basic inventory of what they actually were. The county had looked at a pen full of filth and concluded the filth was the disease. It was not the disease. It was the diagnosis obscuring the patient. She said this once, quietly, wringing water from her cuffs. He wrote it down. They worked until the light began to flatten and the creek shadows stretched east. By then, they had washed and examined 19 animals. 11 showed the same pattern: starved, chilled, recoverable. 4 showed signs that required closer watching. 3 were genuinely uncertain. 1 was not going to make it through the week, and they both understood this without discussing it in those terms. The frock coat had not survived the afternoon intact. A rear seam had given way when he lifted a struggling piglet that weighed more than it appeared, and the left cuff had taken on a permanent stain the color of creek silt and something else he preferred not to catalog. The traveling dress was worse or better, depending on one's view of the matter. She had knelt in it. She had wrung animals in it. She had wiped her hands on it twice without thinking, in the way one wipes one's hands when the work is the only thing in one's mind. Neither of them mentioned replacing the garments. There was no money for that, and more to the point, there was no occasion that would require better clothes before spring. The work clothes had chosen themselves. They carried the animals back in the sling, 2 at a time, and set them in the shelter. Tomorrow they would wash the rest. They finished washing the last of the 72 on the second morning, and by afternoon of that same day, he had already begun on the shelter. The 3-sided hay structure that came with the claim was sound enough in its bones. He had assessed it the first day they arrived, but it would not hold warmth against a Nebraska November, and he knew that warmth, more than feed, more than anything else he could currently offer, was the variable most likely to determine whether the weakest animals survived the next 30 days. He sourced salvaged lumber from the grain mill's scrap pile. Paying for it with an afternoon of labor, he did not mention to her until the evening, when she asked where he had been for 3 hours. She noted it in the way she noted most things he told her, without excess, with evident interest. He packed the straw walls himself, pressing it in tight against the lumber framing with his forearm, testing the density with his knuckles. The work took 4 days. On the 5th day, he built the troughs. 2 long ones, hand-hewn from elm sections he split behind the sod house, while the afternoon light still held. She came out twice to look at the dimensions. The second time she brought a strip of birch bark on which she had drawn measurements, and he adjusted the depth of one trough by 2 inches without comment, because she was correct. Her experiments with the mash had begun on the 3rd day. The dried whey had arrived by wagon from the dairy claim north of town. She had written a brief, precise note to the dairy wife the morning after the auction, offering to pay a fair price per pound, and the dairy wife had sent twice the requested amount with a return note that said only "good luck to you" in a hand that suggested she meant it charitably, but did not expect it to matter. The ratios required testing. Too much cornmeal, and the mixture thickened beyond what the weakest piglets could manage. Too little, and it passed through them without holding warmth. She worked through 4 variations in 5 days, recording each in a small notebook she kept on the shelf beside the stove, the pages already lightly stained with cornmeal dust at the edges. He made the first journal entries on the 7th day of October, 1874, 7 days since acquisition. 72 animals weighed on arrival by approximate method, range from 4 to 9 pounds. 3 losses in first 6 days, cause prior depletion, not recoverable under any practical regimen. 69 remaining. Of these, 52 showing appetite and moderate response to warmth, 11 requiring additional monitoring, 6 classified uncertain. He paused at the word uncertain. It was the most he would allow himself. Coat condition improving in the majority. Appetite responding to reduced mash temperature. She observed that they take the warm feed faster when cooled slightly at the surface, adjusting accordingly. Outside, the wind had shifted. It was coming out of the northwest now, the first time since they had arrived that it carried something other than the smell of dry grass. The northwest wind that had first arrived in late October did not leave. It settled in over the prairie like something that had made a decision, and by the first week of November, it had grown a different quality. Not merely cold, but purposeful, stripping the last of the dry grass flat against the earth, and driving a fine grit through every gap in the sod walls. He noted the barometric signs on the 4th of November. Wind sustained from northwest, sky color at evening, yellow-gray at the horizon, darkening faster than seasonal average. Livestock shelter walls holding, but south-facing gap between 3rd and 4th lumber boards requires immediate attention. He chinked it with packed clay that same afternoon. The blizzard arrived before midnight. She woke to the sound of it. Not a gradual building, but a sudden arrival, as though a door had been thrown open somewhere north of them on the continent. The stove was still warm. She dressed without speaking, and he was already pulling on his coat. They had discussed this possibility. There was nothing left to discuss. He took the spare straw they had stacked inside against the east wall, 12 bundles, kept dry against exactly this, and she took the iron pot from the stove, filled it, and set 2 river stones to heat. The stones were smooth and flat, the size of a man's hand spread open, and she had gathered 6 of them in October without explaining why. He had not asked. He had written only, "She has sourced 6 hearthstones, purpose unstated," filed under preparation. Outside, the snow was horizontal. It did not fall so much as travel. He bent his head and carried the first straw bundle the 30 yards to the shelter in 3 trips, banking the loose material against the north and west walls until the packed straw rose 2 feet above the baseboards. She followed with the first 2 stones wrapped in burlap sacking, the heat coming through in slow pulses against her palms. They worked through the night in a rotation, stoke the stove, heat the stones, carry, return, repeat. They did not speak much. What needed saying had already been said in the weeks of preparation, and what remained was only the work itself, passed back and forth between them like something they were building together in the dark. The piglets, for their part, had pressed themselves into a collective mass in the center of the shelter, the smaller ones buried in the middle as if by some arrangement older than any instruction. She set the wrapped stones at 3 points around the perimeter and stood a moment in the low shelter, listening, breathing. 69 small bodies generating their own heat, augmented now by hers. By 4 in the morning, the storm had not relented. By 6, it began to. When the light came up gray and absolute over the snow-covered quarter section, he opened the shelter door and stood for a moment with his journal open in his hand, the cold air moving past him. He counted slowly. Then he wrote the number down. 69. He closed the journal and looked east, where the sky was beginning, quietly, to change. The day after the first blizzard was the quietest the quarter section had yet produced. The snow had settled into something permanent-looking, smooth and indifferent, covering the fence line, the wood pile, the path between the sod house and the shelter, as though it intended to stay all winter, which it likely did. The wind had gone entirely, replaced by a cold so clean and still it seemed to have its own texture, like glass. He shoveled the path. She carried the morning mash. The piglets received both with their usual frank appetite, and the world, for a morning, asked nothing more difficult than that. It was in this stillness that he sat down with his journal. He had not read it straight through since October. There had been no occasion. Each entry had been written as a record of what was, not as a document to be studied, and the discipline of the thing had been its regularity rather than its accumulation. But now, with the storm spent and the animals settled and the gray light coming flat and even through the south-facing window, he opened it to the first page and read forward. The entries were spare. Date, temperature estimate, weight recorded by feel and later by the rough scale he had fashioned from a wagon board and 2 feed sacks. Coat condition, dull, improving, markedly improved. Appetite, poor, moderate, consistent. He had used a small system of marks, a circle for the animals receiving the plain cornmeal mash, a dash for those receiving the warm whey mixture she had introduced in the 3rd week. He had not compared the 2 columns side by side until now. He did it slowly, running a finger down the rows, and then he did it again. And then he set the journal flat on the table and looked at the window for a moment before he looked back. The animals marked with the dash, the whey-fed animals, were gaining at nearly twice the rate of the others. Not uniformly, not without variation, but the pattern was clear enough that the variation did not disturb it. It was there in week 3 and week 4 and week 6 and week 7. The plain mash animals were gaining, but the whey animals were thriving. He drew a new column in the right margin with a straight edge and a careful hand, and began transferring the comparative figures into it. The column was narrow but sufficient. It took him the better part of an hour. When it was done, he read it twice more, the way a man reads something he wants to be certain he is reading correctly before he allows himself to believe it. She came in from the shelter, cold-cheeked, pulling the door behind her against the weight of the air. She looked at him at the table, at the journal open in front of him, at the particular stillness in his posture that she had come to recognize as the posture of a man who has found something. She did not ask. She set the empty mash pail down and waited, and the quiet between them held the information in the way a jar holds water. Full, sealed, ready. He set the journal down and told her what the column showed. He did not embellish it. He read the figures aloud in the same even tone he used when he read anything aloud. A train schedule, a land deed, a temperature reading at dusk. And she listened, with her hands folded on the table the way she had listened to lectures once. Not passively, but with a focused, measuring attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had suspected something of the kind for 2 weeks, but had not wanted to record a suspicion. He said that was the correct approach. She said she wanted to see the column herself, and he turned the journal toward her, and she read it the same way he had, twice, without comment, until she was certain. Then she nodded once, a small, conclusive motion, and stood to warm her hands at the stove. Outside, the December sky had pressed itself flat and pale against the glass of the south window. The grain merchant arrived that same afternoon. He came in a low wagon with a bay horse that blew steam and stood poorly in the cold. And he came, he said, to discuss the feed account, the question of how much cornmeal they intended to carry through to March, and whether they wished to arrange a price now. He was a broad man with a dark coat and a manner that suggested he preferred speaking to listening. He had been among those standing near the fence in October. She had not forgotten this, though her expression gave no indication of it. Her husband invited him to step into the shelter while she remained in the sod house to prepare the afternoon mash. It was not an arrangement she had been asked to make. She made it because she understood that a man of that particular type would speak more plainly to another man alone, and she was curious what would be said. What was said, she learned later, amounted to very little. The merchant walked the length of the shelter. He looked at the animals, clean-coated, quiet, lying in grouped arrangements on the packed straw in the manner of animals that are not suffering. He looked at the troughs, at the straw walls, at the careful spacing between the pen sections. He said nothing for some time. Then he said that he supposed they hadn't lost them all yet. Her husband thanked him for the observation and said they would carry through on the cornmeal until the end of February and would come to the store to settle the account on the first Thursday of the new year. The merchant nodded, looked once more at the animals as if expecting to find something wrong that he had missed on the first pass, and then turned and walked back to his wagon. She held the door from the inside and closed it after him, firmly but without force, the way one closes a door against wind rather than against a person. In the shelter, 69 animals breathed steadily in the cold air. February arrived without announcement, the way the worst things often do, not with rising wind or visible cloud, but with a stillness so complete it pressed against the sod house walls like something with weight. She noted it in the margin of the feeding log before dawn on the 4th. Air has gone very quiet. By mid-morning, the third blizzard had found them. It lasted 2 days and 1 full night. They moved through it in shifts, she and her husband trading the walk to the shelter every 4 hours, bent nearly parallel to the ground across that 30 yards of drifted white. The animals were managed. The regimen held. But on the second morning, while she measured out the mash, she counted the remaining dried whey and set the canister down and stood for a moment, without moving. They had perhaps 9 days of supply. The regimen required 14 before they could reasonably expect the creek road to be passable for a resupply wagon from town. The gap was not catastrophic, but it was a gap, and she did not allow herself to call it anything else. She told him that evening. He sat with the journal open, read the entry she had drafted, and then wrote beneath it in his own hand. Whey supply, 9 days estimated. Required, 14 minimum. Action required before road clears. The neighboring dairy farm sat 3/4 of a mile north across an open field, closer by foot than by road, if the snow had settled firm enough to hold weight. The farmer there was a widower of about 50, taciturn, who had sold them their first canisters of whey in October without much commentary either way. They had not spoken with him since. Her husband went on the third morning after the storm, when the crust had hardened enough to walk without sinking past the ankle. She watched him cross the field from the south window, a tall, dark figure moving in a straight line across the white, carrying nothing but his journal and the surveying compass that lived in his coat pocket. He was gone 1 hour and 40 minutes. When he came back, he stamped the snow from his boots outside the door, came in, and sat at the table. She poured water that was nearly hot and waited. The farmer had listened, he said, had not interrupted. When the proposal was made, surveying labor and trade, 2 full days of boundary line work comes spring thaw, professionally rendered with written documentation. The farmer had looked at the compass on the table for a long moment. Then he had said that his north pasture line had been disputed for 3 years, and that a proper survey would be worth something to him. The way would be ready in canisters by Saturday. Her husband opened the journal to the current page and wrote in the careful script she had come to read as easily as her own. Supply secured. Regimen unbroken. Outside, the field was very white and very still. The creek broke on the 4th of March. She heard it from inside the sod house, a low, sustained crack, more felt than heard, as though the earth had shifted its weight from one foot to the other. She set down the tin cup she was rinsing and went to the south window. The ice along the near bank had gone gray over the past week, losing its winter opacity, and now the center channel ran dark and quick between collapsing shelves of white. The pasture beyond was the color of old straw, matted and flattened by months of snow, but the ground beneath her boots when she stepped outside was soft in a way it had not been since September. He was already at the shelter, unhooking the rope latch they had added in November against the wind. He did not call to her. He simply left the door open. They moved the herd out together, 69 animals into the open pasture for the first time since October. The piglets, no longer quite the word for them, though the habit held, came out cautiously at first, then in a loose surge, spreading across the wet grass with their heads down and their ears working. She stood at the eastern fence post and watched them without speaking. He stood at the western edge and did the same. Then they walked the fence line. He went first at the corner posts, testing each one with both hands, noting where the packed earth had heaved with the freeze. She followed a step behind, counting. Not aloud, but her lips moved slightly, and she touched the fence wire as she walked as if the counting needed an anchor. 69. Confirmed at the far corner, confirmed again at the gate. They were both wearing the patched clothes. His wool frock coat had been mended at both elbows with leather cut from a worn harness strap. The original fabric around the patches faded to a different shade entirely. Her traveling dress had lost its silk trim entirely by January. What remained was serviceable and dark, and bore a long diagonal stain across the skirt that no amount of scrubbing had fully lifted. They had stopped noticing either garment months ago, or rather, they had stopped minding. At the south fence, where the creek bent close and the ground was still soft, he stopped and opened the journal. He uncapped the ink, steadied the page against the fence post, and began to write. She watched the herd move across the pasture and did not look at what he was writing. She did not need to. He wrote for perhaps 10 minutes, a single column, each animal's estimated weight, recorded in the shorthand he had developed over the winter. 1 line per animal, 69 lines in all. No summary, no conclusion, no word of what it meant that every line was full. He capped the ink and closed the journal. The creek ran fast behind them, and the herd grazed on. The spring fair opened on the second Friday of April, and they drove the herd in on foot, the two of them walking the road into Alma with 69 pigs moving in a loose column ahead of them in the early morning light. No wagon, no hired hand, just the two of them and their animals, and the road still damp from the night's dew. The county land agent had set up his official table beneath a canvas canopy at the fairground's east edge. He was a careful man. Everyone in Harlan County knew that about him. And he ran his measuring tape and his scale without comment, recording each number in his ledger with a clerk's economical hand. But he paused once, near the middle of the count, and looked up at the herd still waiting in the pen, and then back at the page, and then said nothing and kept writing. The pause was enough. 69 animals, every column full. It was the grain merchant who came first. He stood at the fence with his hat in both hands, which was not how he had stood in October, and asked about the weigh-mash, specifically the proportions, the temperature, the frequency. She answered him directly, without warmth and without coldness, the way a school teacher explains a thing that has already been demonstrated. He wrote the figures on the back of a receipt from his coat pocket. The livery owner came next, then the farmer's wife, then the land agent himself, who had by that point already closed his official ledger and approached on his own time as a private citizen. They asked their questions. They received their answers. At one point, the husband opened the journal. The same journal, its cover cracked now at the spine, the pages dense with winter's record, and read aloud from the entries of November and December, when the weight gains had first become measurable and consistent. He read without editorial comment. The numbers spoke in the way numbers do when the record has been kept honestly from the beginning. By mid-afternoon, the four of them, the merchant, the livery owner, the farmer's wife, the land agent, had each shaken the husband's hand. Two of them, separately, nodded to her as well. It was a small gesture. It was also a real one, and she received it with the same composure she had brought to every other transaction of the preceding 7 months. They stayed until the fair closed, then walked the herd back along the road as the light went long and gold across the pasture. At the sod house, he lit the stove, and she set the journal on the table between them. She opened it to the last page with writing on it, the 69 lines from that morning, and then turned to the first blank page that followed. She set the pen beside it without comment. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he picked up the pen and wrote, Year 2. Expansion proposed.